This is Tyler from TANDEMKROSS, making good guns great. And today we'll be going over the installation for our Victory triggers for the Ruger Mark IV and Mark IV 2245. This is one of our most popular products, and since our previous installation video was a couple years old, we figured we would redo it with some of our new fancy recording equipment for you guys. So the installation for the Mark IV or the Mark IV 2245 is going to be virtually identical. Please be aware that if you have a Ruger Mark IV with a metal frame, you will need the Mark IV trigger. If you have a polymer frame, then you'll need the Mark IV 2245 trigger. They're not necessarily one-to-one interchangeable. As far as tools that you will need the Allen key that we provide, some blue Loctite for the set screws. If you're using the original trigger fire control group internals, you will need an empty magazine. And then a recommended tool will be a small Allen or Torx key, something around 1/8 inch diameter, will really help with this installation process. Please be aware that there will be some parts under spring tension, so be mindful of those springs and wear appropriate safety equipment such as safety glasses. To begin the installation, first we need to make sure no magazine, chamber is flagged, but let's be extra sure. Chamber is empty. So we will disassemble the pistol for a Mark IV series. That will be hammer cocked, safety in the safe position. Depress the takedown button, remove the upper. To decock the hammer at this point, if you're using the original trigger internals, you'll need to defeat the magazine disconnect safety. To do that, take that empty magazine, just double check yourself that it's unloaded. Insert the magazine, put it on fire, and then just cover over the hammer and pull the trigger. Let the hammer down gently. Great. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and remove the factory trigger. In order to remove this factory trigger, we'll need to be removing this trigger pivot pin. The trigger pivot pin is held in place by a wire form retaining spring in the frame itself. It comes up from the magazine release beneath this silver trigger disconnect bar, and then it terminates right here. You'll see the end of that little spring. And if you press on it with an Allen key, you'll feel it spring back against you. This is to keep that pin from walking out while you shoot. We'll need to push down that spring to defeat the spring tension and slide that pivot pin out. Best way to do that is to take an Allen key or similar, line it up over the top of that spring, and then press. You'll feel it flex against you, so you know you're contacting that spring. So while that is held down, provide pressure on this trigger pivot pin going left to right, and then just slide it straight through. Now we have taken the pin out. You will notice that the pivot pin is grooved on the right side. When we go to reinstall this trigger, make sure to be aware of that groove and that it ends up on the right side of the trigger. That groove will need to be engaged by that wire form retaining spring again to make sure the pin does not walk out while you shoot. If you're performing this installation with a Ruger Mark IV frame, note Mark IV trigger pivot pins have a small head on the right side, but they also have the groove. Oh, and it's magnetic. So now that we've replaced the pin with an Allen key, we can go ahead and slide it out in a pretty controlled fashion. Just retract it just until you can get the trigger up and out. You don't need to pull the Allen key all the way through the frame. There we go. So once you get a little bit of lift on the trigger, you can slide that pin back through. So once you've gotten it to this point, let's say hypothetically this happens, and then this happens, and now you've got pieces all over. Have no fear, this is just what you're gonna need to find and get back in order. So the trigger just pull this out for a moment. Its plunger and spring are going to go back in the top of the trigger. That's where they live. But the thing that you might be inclined to lose is this little spring. I'll untuck it from the lower. There's this very small spring right here that fits into this hole here where I just inserted the Allen key. This spring provides just some resting spring tension for the internal bolt stop plate so that the bolt stop doesn't bounce up and then cause the bolt to lock open while you're firing. So if all has gone awry and you yank the Allen key out, to get everything back in alignment, I'm just gonna pull up this trigger bar here. Set the trigger back on the bar. Look at the left side of the frame. You can sort of fiddle with the bolt stop plate to get it to line up with the hole in the frame. Insert the Allen key back through there, back through the trigger. Then make sure, if I can get it on camera, that the Allen key ends up on top of the wire form retainer on the right side of the frame. This is why having an Allen key or a similar tool so you can, wiggle it and finagle things to line up is really just an awesome tool to have, just to keep things under control. Now if you take the trigger, pull it to the left, take the trigger disconnect bar, pull it to the right, you'll be able to unhook the two from each other. And then you can take out your trigger as well as that spring and plunger on the top of it. Spring and plunger we're going to need. Trigger is going away. At this point we can prep our trigger for installation. If this trigger is going to be going to a 2245, you'll notice that we ship this with 4 different set screws. This trigger works for both Mark III 2245 as well as Mark IV 2245. If this is a Mark IV 2245 that you have, you can use the longer of the green nylon tip set screws as well as the longer of the non-nylon tip set screws. The shorter of the two will be for a Mark III series pistol. Give each of these screws a little dab of blue Loctite on their threads, and we can pre-install these set screws into the trigger. The non-nylon tip, the one that does not have a green point on it, will install in the top of the trigger. A little bit of a tight squeeze, so we recommend dropping it in from the top, backwards, you might say, so that the tip of the screw will be coming out the top of the trigger, and the head of the screw with the that 1.5 millimeter drive head will be near the trigger face, so that you may adjust the trigger with it installed in the pistol. Now we'll go ahead and pre-install the Overtravel screw. That's the one with the green tip. So just get that more or less halfway spun into the trigger. And then with the pre-travel screw, just halfway as well. That way we can drop the trigger in and then do the adjustments and not have to get those screws in while maneuvering around the trigger guard. So returning to the frame with your preset trigger, we will take the trigger plunger and spring from before, drop the spring into the top of the trigger, and likewise with that plunger, lifting the trigger bar up, settle the trigger into the trigger well line the pin on the disconnect bar up with the hole in the top of the trigger. Depress the plunger, slide those two pieces together like so. So now that we're here, we're going to take this keeper Allen key, slide it back to the left just until it clears the trigger. Pulling down on the trigger, you'll feel the trigger drop down once the Allen key's out of the way. Nice. Now if you look through the through hole on the right side, you can see the holes and visually line up the trigger pivot pin hole and slide that Allen key back through. Excellent. Now we can return to the trigger pivot pin. Again, it is grooved and the groove will go on the right side. So just take your finger, slide that Allen key just so it's flush to the frame. Line up your pin, get it started, and then you can use this Allen key to wiggle and maneuver those parts to make sure that all the through holes line up between the pin and the trigger and all that good stuff. There we go. So now we have some trigger movement. It's clearly pinned in. You felt the click of the groove and the wire form retainer engage each other. That's nice. Now let's do those trigger set screw adjustments. This is the real main benefit of our Victory Trigger, being able to dial out all of that excess movement. So you can take your 1.5 millimeter short leg Allen key, insert it in to the pre-travel screw hole, and you'll see as you begin to tighten it, if you look closely at the face of the trigger, that it is rotating back every time I give it a turn here. So a good place to check is when the textured portion of the Victory Trigger is this piece here, is visually perpendicular to this top line of the frame. So let's give it a couple more turns. It should be pretty close. Oh, looks like it was just one. So we're just gonna leave the Overtravel screw where it is for now. We can do that at a later point. Next, we're gonna need to recock the hammer so that we can install it back onto the upper and double check the pre-travel and then dial in the Overtravel adjustment. If you're using the factory internals for the hammer as well, you'll need to pull out that empty mag again, lock it in, thumb the hammer back. It's a pretty stiff spring. There we go. Move the mag, safe. Now we can pop the upper back on. Due diligence, check the chamber. So we have hammer cocked, put it on fire, feel the trigger. Doesn't feel like there's a lot of take up, so we're probably pretty close to the final adjustment on the pre-travel. Let's go ahead, pull the trigger with that magazine in again, because there's the magazine disconnect safety still. All right, now with the trigger pinned to the rear, go ahead, rack the bolt, let go. And that delayed reset that you just heard, where I let my trigger finger off and then there was about a half second before you heard the click, that's indication that the pre-travel is too tight. So I'm gonna go ahead and dial that back another quarter turn, and we'll repeat that test. Good click. Immediate nice reset. And at this point, once you've found your reliability point, I would recommend backing off the pre-travel screw an additional quarter turn to maintain reliability regardless of temperature or other environmental conditions. So Click. Click. Awesome. Now that we have the pre-travel screw dialed in, we can take up the over-travel adjustment. With this screw, there are not nearly as many tricks to it. You'll just need to dial this out to take up excess trigger movement after the shot has broken. If you go too far, which we will show in a moment, the trigger will not function. All right, so as I have it adjusted, the over-travel screw is too far out the back of the trigger. You can tell because when you pull the trigger, the screw engages, but we don't get a click. From here, we can adjust this over-travel set screw back this way until we can get the hammer to drop. Excellent, so now we have gotten back over that line and we have a reliably set over travel. So let's just verify that one more time. Great. At this point, now that we know that it's reliable, I'll just give it a little bit more room just to make sure that everything is always going to run 100%. Just another quarter turn back. And we have successfully installed the trigger, set the pre-travel and over travel screws. And with that blue Loctite, once you've allowed it to cure for about 24 hours, those screws will be firmly set in the trigger so that they will not be moving on their own. And you have successfully installed your Victory Trigger for either Ruger Mark IV or Ruger Mark IV 2245. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.
Make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video on whatever social media platform you use. I'm Luke with Tandem Cross, and we're here to make your good guns great. Keep up with us on social media for daily updates. I'll see you next time.